Thanks, Zishan. And I'll just quickly get everything set up for you. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep, we can see it.
Great. Yes, so as Zishan mentioned, my name is Malandi and I'm a technical consultant at Interactive. We're an end user, but a technology company, and we're doing really cool things. I'm just going to talk about our journey with our implementation of the quote to cash process using various Microsoft integration strategies. So the problem statement that was given to us was to go and consolidate all our various sets of systems. They were all disparate, they were across the different lines of business, and to bring them under the Microsoft Dynamics umbrella. So why Microsoft? We really wanted to, we actually, as annoying as it sometimes is, to keep these environments upgraded and updated. It is actually a really good thing for our business and our continued growth. So we really wanted to get on, use that, leverage that. And also the Dynamics platform is a gateway to many other products. So if we wanted to incorporate HR field services, we would have the baseline to do it. And then also their integration strategies between the systems. It's configurable and it's pretty powerful. And over and above that, it saved us countless of dev hours. Sometimes just building these integrations from scratch is just too time consuming. So that was really appealing to us. So the strategies we used was dual write, and we all know what it is. If you don't, speak now. But it's basically a tightly coupled real-time integration between CE and F&O. Then we use the data integrator, which I always call the granddad of integration strategies. It's just a one-way sync, but it works really well with high volume transactions. And then lastly, we used virtual entities. So this is probably my favorite of the integration strategies because it shows you the real McCoy of data just sort of through the looking glass from CE. You expose it in the context of CE. So it's pretty powerful. And what I like about it is if your data is mastered in finance, you can just expose it instead of having to do a complicated integration. So what I'll do though is I'm going to touch on every strategy and some of the learnings that we learned, I guess. And with dual write, one of the most important things and your key focus should always be your integration key. You've got to realize that your integration is always going to try and honor the integration key. So spend your time here, get it right. If you don't, your mapping is going to be throwing errors. And fun fact, your integration won't work as you expect it to if you don't get this right. But we had a weird scenario where we're using an ISP and they had an integration key in finance, in operations, on an enumerated value. So, and it was included in the key, but you can't do the same in CE. So we had to get clever. We thought, okay, let's convert this enumerated value into a text field and use that in the map, and then you use that. Anyways, thought we could use a calculated field to do this piece of logic, but you can't actually map a calculated field either because the calculated field has too many characters after as its underlying type. So we used the business rule to just populate a text field and then integrate it using that. I mean, it's not ideal, but it wasn't our entity. We had to make it work. And then just with regards to lookup values, when you're using an integration key and you have to use a lookup in this key, sometimes in the dual write mapping, it would behave a bit funny. You'll open up your map and it just won't find the field. So just a tip here is that you have to make sure the related table is also in your mapping and the integration key underneath that table, the related table, is also configured correctly. As soon as you do that, you refresh your mapping, boom, it's there. So spend time on your integration keys. It's basically the core of all the integration strategies to just behave the way you want it to expect to behave. Okay, stop me at any time if you have a question. I'm just going to keep powering through. If I need to explain something a bit better, just stop me there. So performance with DualWrite, if you've used it, it's not the best user experience. There is definitely a delay when you save or update a record. So we decided, so I'll just mention, I did see though, we're running platform update 43, and one of their quality updates has performance enhancements around the customer integration, as well as overall DualWrite performance improvements. So that's on the build version 10.0837168. Don't know if you're going to remember that, but ping me if you want to know. I'll send you the details. I haven't deployed it yet, so I don't know. But what we did to get around that like user experience issue is we implemented an integration status. And that really helped us. The point was to allow the user to continuously make their changes on the record until they're really happy, until it's really integration ready. And then once it was ready, we would then update the status that would actually reflect the filter criteria would then pick it up from the DualWrite mappings to send this across. So what I liked about this approach was because all our transactions got created first, so it would be a status draft, for example, you'd have your transaction integrity in CE. And then once you try to update, so to allow it to sync, and I'll just show you, maybe I'll just move to the next slide so you can see what I'm talking about. So we used this line status confirmed, and we said, as a rule, only, over here you'll see it, when it's a confirmed status, allow it to sync. So essentially that gave our users the ability to capture until they're ready, but it also allowed us to have a record of the transaction. And then if the synchronization failed, we would update our originating record with a status error, and we could troubleshoot it. And when it was ready, we could resubmit it. So sometimes what happens if you just send it across with DualWrite, it will roll back the transaction. So this was pretty good in preventing that. So you still had your transactional integrity. I'll touch on this synchronized field a bit later. It has another purpose, but I'll come back to it. But yeah, I could really recommend using a status. It's just a bit of a two-step process, but it gives you your transactional integrity in the source system until it's ready to be synchronized. So just timeouts. I don't know if you guys know, but CE has a 2-minute hard limit on the plugin. So for high volume transactions, it just times out. So we had to get clever. And what we did is we implemented a web API that will process outside the scope of CE to get around this 2-minute limitation. We've got sometimes 1,000 lines more going through. So it's not enough time. Like even anyway, so what we did is we moved the logic out into a web API, which we call, and I'll just show you what we did. And we schedule it through a Power Automate. So we'll count our lines, we'll decide, is it enough to process within 2 minutes? And then we'll either process it through the plugins, or we'll send it off to the web API. And then with the web API, all these processes sort of run asynchronously. So the user will just submit it, carry on with their work, and at some point at the end of this, a flow the Power Automate will send a message to them, a Teams message to say, this has been processed, you can get back to it. So maybe just keep that in mind, that if you have like process intensive transactions, don't try and code the logic in your plugin, move it out into a web API, get clever. Yeah, so that's what you did. So no loopbacks. I think most of you have hit this one. If you're syncing, let's say you do a create from CE into finance, and you're defaulting a bunch of values into that create. Don't expect those defaults to make its way back to CE automatically. You have to, the DualWrite triggers in one transaction scope. To get those updates or those new fields across, you'll have to trigger another transaction. So what we did is we implemented business events on the inserts to just be consumed from CE once it triggers, and to update those critical values we wanted to see almost immediately. Just on that though, when you're defaulting values on your record in finance, it's worth noting that there's a crucial design element in dual rights design. So this is a quote that I got from Microsoft support, and I thought I'd just pop it in here. How I was taught and how I've done it all the years is the best practice was always, I assumed, put your default logic as close to the data source as possible. So, for example, if you have a parameterized value you want to default onto an account record, if you're using any other input after that default, it would override that parameterized value. So your customer account would default with, say, a customer group, but your data migration, whether it be through DMF or form input, would override whatever that value is with whatever you put in. With deal right, it's different. It fires differently. Your entity method initialization fires first, and your table method initialization fires last. So what you want to do is, and this is specific to enumerated values. So if you have a default coming in as no, but your parameterized value is coming through as a yes, you want to do something to force that no, because the parameterized value is going to override the no. That's what it means. So this is a tricky one, and it's by design. The product team came back to me that that's the design of deal right. It's to do with another issue they're having on enums, but this is what I did on my entity, because this is in essence what it is. This is very technical in nature. So essentially, I check the data source, I find my enumerated field that I really want to go through, and I just check, is it not set? Because that's what they did. If the value comes through, the default value is no, it's not set, and then I just force it to a set state, and it'll pick up the value from the entity. But you could always do what they recommend and just put your initialize your default after the table method initialization, try and default the value again. That's up to you. This is how I did it. So just there are some things about it that behaves differently than what you would be used to. Then evaluate your bidirectional requirements. As I mentioned, like we have high volume transactions. So once our transactions reach finance and we say would take 1,000 lines of hold, we'd get the old timeout error again. So we decided to do one-way integration into our system. So, and then because once it reached finance, at that point it was mastered in finance. So it's sort of staged in CE, and then it's just pushed across, and then it's mastered in finance. And we decided to, whatever the changes was that was captured in finance, we could always trickle back into CE using the data integrator, because it didn't need to be real time, because they would work with the data in CE. But to keep the data integrity there, we would send the data back to CE using a data integrator. And that's a great segue into the data integrator again. So,
sorry, Melanie, I got a couple of questions if you want to take now.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so, if you can please go back to your previous slide.
Yes.
So you talked about no loopbacks here. So I understand. So how would you take this particular scenario where a company is offering 24/7 service, and they have their portal, and this is where the users go and raise their request, and those requests are actually, the portals are on the CE side, and yes, this particular request comes down to FNO. But what happens if the request got filled into CE somehow, or maybe it didn't make to FNO somehow just because of some data validations or whatever could be the reason? Now, how would you trigger this information, or what would be your scenario if the information got filled in FNO, but the customer still wants to see this information in FNO, and there is no view or display in dual right where we can find out what went wrong, why this request didn't get created in FNO?
Okay, so this is why I used my integration statuses based on the first step, because when it fails, I update that record to status error, and I log the error against the record. So it's almost like I have a staged view of, so I start off with draft, the customer enters their details, and then it saves first before it syncs. And then once they prompt that sync, it's a two-step process. So they can save, but they have to do something else to prompt the sync. Once it does that sync and it fails, I can capture that error and I can write it to my line. I say validation error, update the status to error, and I return that error. So I didn't lose my transactional integrity. What they wanted to do is there, it just can't make it into FinOps because of a validation error. And but finance is actually pretty clear on what the error is. And there's one more thing I can tell you is that if you wanted to look at the error in the trace logs on the environment monitor, if it's like a vague validate error, validate write failed, you can actually search, I think the phrase is write failed to table in the logs. You can literally just search for that string within a time period and it will bring back the full error and not just the vague error in the logs. So that's how I worked around and why I say use an integration status, because then you can maintain your transactional integrity. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it makes sense. So that's the same scenario. The reason I raised this question just to put some more clarity on using this integration status here for all our audience here, because the same scenario which we implemented in one of the customers using, because that's a two-step process now. It's not if you are adding an integration status, this is not going to be real time now.
Yes.
That is adding a manual step. Am I right?
Yes. Well, with us, you're right. We click a button. We force them to, we say, click this button before you can actually integrate. And this button will then go and trigger everything. And if it fails, it will just update the records and process the next one. And so we end up with a list of past records, which is all confirmed. We know they went through because the status is confirmed, or we get a list of errors, or we get draft, which means, they haven't actually been processed. But yeah, it is a two-step process, but I think it just enhances your user experience, because if the error gets lost, it's really difficult to troubleshoot it without error message. And I find it's an easy fix if you have this. It's a difficult fix if the data goes missing and your user has to recapture everything. So it's all about the user's experience and managing their, their frustration in terms of using the system as well.
Yep, absolutely makes sense. And one of the other thing which I just want to check with you, if you go back to one more slide, please.
Yep.
One more, please. Sorry.
Sure. More?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes. So what was the reason did you go with the web APIs? Would you please talk a little bit more about the web APIs? From finance and operations, like we don't know what are the web APIs and how we can know more about this web APIs and where we should be going further down the path with the implementations with the web APIs.
Okay, so what we did is you actually write your .NET code for plugins in Visual Studio in CE, and then, but like I said, there's a 2-minute hard timeout. So if you're processing 1,000 records, it's going to time out after 2 minutes if you didn't finish all 1,000 sending them across to DealWrite. And we all know DealWrite isn't the fastest performing tool at the moment. So we were trying to send 1,000 lines across, and it would just time out and roll back a bunch of things. So we were like, okay, we need to get clever. So I spoke to some of our CE dev team, and they said, well, what we could do is we could move. So you keep the code in finance, but you build it as a web API service. I mean, not in finance, in Visual Studio. And you literally just deploy it as you go to Azure portal, you register an app, and you call your code from there. And what you do is you pick up, you can pass through the parameters as you would have, for example, the order ID, and you just pop it across here. It executes exactly the same code. It's just exposed or managed differently, and it's managed outside the context of CE. Still calls CE, but it processes outside the 2-minute limit, hard limit. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So,
Yes, yes.
okay, so that's how you would get around, unless you can find a way to get all your transactions across in less than 2 minutes, but we have really high volumes. I mean, we're talking about anything from 1,000 to 30,000 lines sometimes. So this works for us, and it works quite well. I think we've moved like
Yes.
200,000 lines.
No, I really like this approach.
Yeah.
It's actually
So,
really good one. Yes, that's nice.
yeah, so keep that in mind, because it's C is a lot of stuff. Like, there's a lot of components to it, but you can do a lot. Like, this is just one of the things you can actually just use, and you can write all your code and test it in the plugin, just convert it to a service and call the service from wherever. So it's actually an easy switch. It wasn't too complicated to switch. Some refactoring was needed in terms of the .NET frameworks, but I'm not across all the detail. It's a little bit not exactly my field.
So that's what Microsoft is like. That this is where Microsoft is heading to, taking things out of the FinOps and the CE, writing the microservices there,
Yeah.
and pushing the load out of the finance exactly. Like,
Yes.
we do have the inventory calculation stuff now, inventory
Yes.
visibility. It's a microservice which is outside of finance and operations, but it's pulling data from finance now.
Yes.
This is good. Yeah, thank you so much for all the answers.
Okay, great. I'm glad I could answer, Kelly. So let's get back
Melanie,
to...
sorry, just,
Yeah.
one more question. So would the web API work the other way from CE to FO?
This is
Because
CE.
this example is into CE, but would that work the other way?
I actually don't know. I haven't tried it. But I guess it could. You could still consume a service from finance. So
It can work, because eventually the web API in C it's a .NET code, and
yeah.
you are behind the scenes, you are actually using the same code which is written into the plugins, but
Yes.
the same way you can call the services or consume services within the .NET, or you can consume FNO services within a .NET. So technically it should work. Like, I myself do not see
Yes.
any issue with this one. But for that one, we do have a concept in finance itself, writing the web services and the APIs there.
Yeah.
So if you really want to push data from FO to C, so we would rather use those services there.
So to kind of get back to my presentation, because again, you're looking at dev time for handling these things, right? And there are configurable options. So we didn't opt to do the high volume sync back into CE using a web service or anything else. We didn't code anything. We decided we're just going to go with what Microsoft gives us, and that's configurable. So like Faisal says, go ahead, do it. It's absolutely possible. But just know that you can save yourself some time by just doing it through an integrator. It depends on what your business needs and how often you need the data there. But for us, this worked because the data that we master in finance, we didn't want it to impact our user experience. We didn't want to kick off something that would delay input or user input or have it hinder them in any way. So the data integrator was a really good answer for us. It's basically an older technology, but it still handles high volume transactions. And it saves you unnecessary dev time and maintaining your own custom services. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so one of the things I've learned over the years is that once you start writing your own services, you're not as supported by Microsoft by them. So because you wrote them, it's your problem. There's nothing much you can do. So I personally prefer to leverage the full strength of Microsoft when I want to do it, when I can. Right. So just a little bit on the integrator. With your connections, it's a bit buggy. And first things first, when you do create a connection, make sure your integration account has a valid Power Apps license. Otherwise, execution will fail after 50 executions. It will just stop. It won't fail, it just stop and you'd have to start it up again. So this is a little thing we learned. What's weird with their connections though is it gives you a list of your connections, but it doesn't tell you the context of the list of where it's managed. So if you have a UAT, a test, a dev, and a production environment, and you don't know where this account lives or is managed. Is this connection in production? Is it in UAT? You don't know. Then you have the option to add a new connection, but they just give you this deprecated account. And you can use it, but it doesn't return all your templates. The mapping doesn't find all your lookup values. It's quite painful using this one. So my best advice, get a dedicated production integration account that only gets managed in production and nowhere else, so that you know you're using the right account. There is a way to export the connection once you've configured it and compare the GUIDs. It is, but if you're using an account that perhaps got created in the reference got created in a UAT environment, and you restore production across UAT, you lose that connection, or someone wipes that. You want to rebuild the environment. You lose that connection, all your integration fails, and you have to reconfigure it essentially because you have to recreate the connection and start from scratch. So this did happen to us. So just be mindful. We have an admin account that we thought we could just use, and it was managed in the wrong environment. So that's just something there. In terms of integration stability with the data integrator, we have seen the bigger your scheduled time frame, the better and more stable your integration. So if 15 minutes will better, more consistently integrate data than 5 minutes. So the shorter your time frame, you'll sometimes find that you lose transactions. So if you can bump up that integration to like 15 minutes, even more, you'll get better integration stability. Anyways, so that's just some things. And then this is where it gets really interesting with our implementation, because we opted to follow this route where DealRay doesn't have a data loop. The data integrator calls the data loop, because in CE, if you update a CE record to the same value, so if you update account name to exactly the same value that you sent through from FinOps, so it didn't change, but it's update, it overwrites that same value with the same value, it triggers an update. So all our integration then triggered a dual write update back to finance, which made this integration really slow. And to fix that problem, we implemented the synchronized field. So what we did is we said, all right, we'll default map it. We'll say, okay, send this across. Once it reaches finance, this is the default value. Yes, it's synchronized. We're happy. And then we exclude it from our integration list. So that way, by the time the transaction made its way back to CE, it would be yes, and it wouldn't trigger deal right because it failed on this condition. So this is how things start to flow when you start building these integrations. Then we learned another thing, deletes. Deletes will only work, and I'll just go back. If you're deleting a record from finance and you're expecting it to delete in CE, you only have to map the integration keys for this to work on the dual write map. You have to map them as bidirectional. But if your CE record doesn't adhere to this criteria, it won't delete it. And this was introduced by Microsoft as part of a fix when they have multiple entities. So example, accounts and contacts that map to accounts map to customers in finance and accounts map to contacts in finance. So it's the same entity, but it has two finance mappings. And they implemented that rule to make sure you're not deleting the wrong thing. It has to adhere to that filter criteria. So that's an interesting one. So I'll just get back to how we use business events to manage this. So we use business events on most of our, to trigger the updates. So when you create the records in finance to get those default values across, we use business events, and also for deletes, we implemented a business event to just essentially, we consume it in Power Automate. This is our business event that we've registered, and then we get the integration key values here, and then find the list and apply the delete. And that's how we got around that problem. So this is at this point sort of our end-to-end across the major integrations for how we manage the bulk updates across the systems without affecting our users, our end user experience. And that now, if you want to ask me anything about data integrator, because I'm going to head into virtual entities next. So everyone happy if I continue? Okay, great. So virtual entities is my absolute favorite. So in terms of timing, this only became available 2 weeks before we went live. So we could, what was nice about it, it gave us an answer to a problem we were having at the time. We wanted to show all our, the resulting transaction based on our original integration. So the invoices and invoice lines, we wanted to see those in CE. So what's great about it is we can actually expose the invoices in CE using the virtual entities to our account executives, and they can see it within the context of customer engagement, which is great because it's sort of where it needs to be and people see it where it needs to be. Just be mindful, the virtual entities have full CRUD capabilities. So you can create, read, update, delete, everything. So for us, anyway, let me stop there. Just in terms of, wait, I want to actually go back to this because I want to tell you something. The roles that you, because of the full CRUD capability, you should really be mindful of the roles you give your user. You want to give them limited access, just read-only access. And also you've got to keep in mind, if you're restoring production to UAT, the connection doesn't get wiped or anything. So if you're going in there thinking it's a dev environment and nobody's updated the connection to point to not point to production, you're going to be working with production data. So make a mental note to always update your virtual entity configuration after a restore. You don't want people thinking they're working in UAT when they're actually looking at production data. So be mindful of that. That's just a bit of a warning. Nothing bad's happened to us. I'm just thinking it's a really important point to note. So again, your synthetic relationships, mind your integration keys. The integration keys are again key here. I'll just do a quick slide on what you need to do your virtual entities. So you want to do an app registration and then configure it in finance. And you need an app user. It doesn't need to be an AD user. You want to assign the virtual entity application role to it. And then this is how you build your synthetic relationship. You extend your entity and you use the key, that's the integration key that lives on the CE entity, and this is your CE entity, and you basically build a like-for-like map in finance. You build it, you compile it, and then you go to CE in the advanced filter, you find your available finance and operations entities, and you set this baby to yes. That will then expose this entity as if it is a Dataverse table, and you can embed it in your forms and link to it, and it's actually a beautiful concept. The date bug. I'm bringing this up because it actually taught me quite a bit about how virtual entities work. So in Platform Update 36, they introduced a date bug, which meant, and I'll just go back, that this relationship wasn't, this wasn't working. It was returning all our records. So as you can imagine, it's a little bit tricky when you're logging into your portal and you're looking at everyone else's invoices. So it was a bit of an issue. So, but what it did teach us is that, sorry, I want to go back, is that when you are, the integration keys at runtime get converted or get sent through to finance, and it gets, runtime query gets built and is executed again finance. So you can actually debug this in finance and put a breakpoint and see why and where it's going wrong. So I'm just going to show you. So because it was a date bug and I didn't need it, I just built a new integration key, excluding the date, and then published that and went to all my forms and views and used this relationship, and that solves our problem. Deleting an integration key or a synthetic relationship is really difficult because it gets put in the managed solution, Microsoft virtual entity solution, and you have to get product team to actually run a mitigation script to remove it for you. So the quickest way around it is to just build a new integration key in a new map. Yeah, so, and then just if you wanted to debug this, then I'd suggest putting a breakpoint on the CDS virtual entity filtering class. And then you can see what's being sent through and how the query looks at the time you want to just understand why the data isn't returning as you're expecting it to. The last point I'm going to raise is that the sales invoice lines you all saw me use, it's now obsolete. The V2, there's now a sales invoice lines V3. So just keep this in mind. If you are at a point in your development, I'm just showing you that it's been marked obsolete, that you can change direction and pivot towards using the new entity, do it now. Otherwise, it's just a bit of rework. So if you're not across it and you have started implementing it, just maybe get across changing it to version 3. And yeah, then basically all you have to do is once you've done that, just make it visible and use it, same as before. Yeah, so my final thoughts, I suppose, around virtual entities is that we've actually started using it more and more on our smaller integrations, but because we're still not sure how it behaves, we opt to stage the first transactions into finance, because if it's mastered in finance, and then work with the data in finance, and then just expose the virtual entity. So we're using it a bit of a two-step process. We have written like some logic where we can query the virtual entities direct to get like the last invoice date or stuff like that. So, and it's not too slow. It used to be quite slow. It wasn't really behaving the way we wanted it to, but it seems to have picked up a bit. So there's some optimizations there. For us to implement it, I don't know what would be involved to implement it as the integration strategy and writing to it. But in terms of our implementation, it would be a really big refactoring process. So we are going to rely on it more on the smaller integrations and anything new coming in, and do like a bit of a assessment on how we would want to, would there be benefit in doing it this way. It all depends on where it's mastered and what the kind of information is you would be writing in there, the volumes and those kinds of things. So keep in mind that you can do that, but I haven't done as much with it, so I can't give you those answers, but happy when someone does go down that road to come back here and learn about it from them. Yeah, and that, guys, is all I've got for you. I will just, oops, come back here and stop sharing.
So,
right.
Got one question. So may I ask one question here, Dishan?
Yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat here.
Okay, so I got a question here for Melindy.
Yeah.
So we are getting data out of financial operations to CE using virtual entities. So you talked about the sales invoices and other transactional data, and hopefully we are exposing or showing this data somewhere onto the portals. Now, you as a CE user, do you need to have a any sort of license for finance and operations to view this data?
You do have to be a finance user, but you don't need to consume one of the expensive licenses. So we've only given our users like read-only access on the entity and just the entity, like none of the forms. That suffices for them to see the data. Does that make sense? So it's just a standard invoices. Yeah, you just build a role, you add your entity to it, and they're obviously, we need them in finance because they're employees, and so it's fine, but we don't give them one of our supply chain licenses. So they just view the entity. They just have read-only access to the role they have a read-only role access to the entity, and then that's enough for them to just view it in CE.
All right, so if we got like maybe 500 users who are going to query this data from CE portals to get these invoices done, then we have to have these 500 licenses in finance and operations.
Okay, so customers, no. Customers, no. Users, yes. You have your how do I say this? So if you have a CE user that is a business user for your own company and they're an employee, they need to be in finance. If you are a customer and you're just logging onto the portal, you don't need access. That role that I showed you, that FinOps virtual entity role, I'll show you again. Give me a minute to go back to it.
Yeah. Sure. So you did add an application ID, then attach a user there.
That slide that I showed you. I'm just going to get to it, and then I'm going to share my screen again. I can get there. Boom. So that's what I said. This user here, it's an app user, and that's all you need for your portal to work. And it needs to have that
particular role.
Particular role. It's a Microsoft role that Microsoft gives you that you need to create. And that's all you need for your portals and your customers to be able to see these invoices. They don't need finance access, but your business users, your account executives in CE, in the context of CE, they have to have the role.
Thank you. Last question is, how would you rate between all these three different integration strategies from the performance perspective?
So I am pretty impressed with the data integrator performance-wise. We handle, I'll tell you, like we handle, I think we could think, it's essentially the initial sync process uses the same concept. It uses the data integrator as well. So in terms of performance for bulk updates, the data integrator does really well. Dual-write, it is a bit slow, but like I said, they did just they did just release performance enhancements in one of the later quality updates. I don't know what that means. I haven't seen it in action yet, but it's great to know it's there. And then virtual entries, that query into the environment isn't too fast, but I guess it all depends on the amount of data you want to see. Like there is definitely like a couple of seconds delay, maybe like half a minute if you're unlucky. Overall, my experience has been dual-write works without fail. If you configure it correctly and everything's right, it works. As long as you don't try to pop, you sort of have to queue them and get them across, but it just always works. So it's the one part of my integration that I never worry about. Like if you do it right, it works. So think about that bidirectional requirement. Do you really need that kind of lag on everything? Can you implement something else to have the data go back that's not as important, near time versus real time? I think the way we implemented it, I really like it because I like the fact that we get, when business releases the orders, they really want to see them there. You can set it off to run asynchronously, which doesn't affect your user experience, sort of chugs along. And then you have the Teams notification coming through saying, oh, this one is processed, you can now action it. Like the whole experience is really nice because of the Microsoft add-ons that they give you. So I don't know if that answers your question. I just feel like every integration
it does.
works well for what you've got to kind of analyze what you want this data to do and then choose it based on that.
No, it does. It does answer all my questions. Thank you. Do you see any limitations from the virtual entities perspective?
There was something that someone wrote on Yammer where they were trying to do dual writes. They enabled dual write on a virtual entity, and it wasn't behaving as expected. And I saw that Jeff commented, and I'll try and find the Yammer article sent to you, that it's because of it doesn't have a version stamp. So that's the one thing I think. Initially, we were looking at it because we were integrating HR with finance, and I could get all the departments, which is traditionally managed in HR, but we started off with finance, so we wanted to do it the other way. And I could actually do that. I could do a full initial sync using a virtual entity from finance into HR, which I thought was brilliant. But then it seems like there is a bit of a, but you don't need it if you could use it in the plugins and write to it through the CRUD functionality. But we did have some problems in terms of slow response times using it. And then the one thing that has me a little bit worried is we implemented it, it worked once we got to platform update 36 because there was a date bug and it broke everything quite badly. So that's something that worries me a bit. But what I like about it again is that I can debug it. Where I can't always debug. You know, you can debug it, but like when you're in a production environment, you can't connect to that service. I don't know if you guys know that. You can't debug deal right pointing to UAT on dev.
No, you can't.
Yeah. So that's, but you could probably do it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Melindy, for answering all my questions. Back to you, Dishan.
All right. Any further questions on this particular topic? As of now, I don't see any queries.
Then I probably explained it really well.
Of course, yeah. It was very insightful. Those who have already worked on
a question. If I do want to know more about, say, creating an extra step for logging an error in DRI when it's doing a real-time sync or near-time sync, where can I find those kind of information?
So DealRight, you have to go and I don't know if you know this. So in Excel, you can connect to the DealRight project configuration entity and set the flag is debug to yes and publish that entity back. Then if you get the error while you're transacting, it will actually put it in the table called DealRight error log. So you can just browse to it in the menu browser. So you go menu item sys-table browser equals DealRight error log, and then you can actually see the error, the full error that was returned. Does that help?
Yeah. So thanks a lot for that.
Okay.
So we just need to place a flag on this error log on the DealRight entity. It should give us an inquiry screen as an error if it fails.
Yeah, so you basically open up Excel, you go to your Dynamics add-ins, you connect to finance, you find in the list of drop-down DealRight project configuration or DealRight, and then it returns a list of your entities. The entity that's giving you the problem, there's an is debug field. You set that to yes, you press publish, and then you go and redo the action, and the error that it sends will get captured in the transaction error table. Be mindful though, if you stop your mapping for some reason and you start it up, you have to redo this. It's not enabled by default. It's disabled when you stop it, and you have to go back and do it when you start up your mapping again.
Okay, is this a new feature, Melanie, on this area? I mean, to see this error?
No. It's been there for a while. I don't know how I found it. What I'll do is I'll find the article and send it on. Let me make a note. There's 2 articles that I wanted to send through. The one was around the virtual entity by dual write that Jeff said why it was a bit problematic, and the other one is the enabling the dual write error log. I'll find it and I'll send it to you if you want to distribute it to the members of this team.
Yep.
But there
Thanks
is
for
an
that.
article that I found that you can do this with.
Okay. Okay. Sure. Any other question, guys? All right. Thank you very much, Melody, for your time and for speaking on this particular session. It is very much important especially for CE and FinOps integration in order to assess which integration is required. And obviously, your experience values a lot for us. If we will be having any queries, we will be putting it on your YouTube video as well, to see how it goes, and definitely people can reach you directly over LinkedIn. All right. So that's it for today. We will be having another session after bi-weekly probably. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Melody, again for your time, for all your inputs and insightfuls.
No problem.
Great.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, team.